Behind enemy lines in World War II Russia, winter temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Wet snow drove sideways through the forests. Biting winds cut through worn-out clothing. German patrols combed the countryside, hunting for Soviet partisan fighters scattered in remote marshes and woodlands. These resistance fighters were days, sometimes weeks, from any friendly town. They faced an impossible choice: freeze to death in the open or risk capture by seeking shelter in villages where the enemy waited. But Russian partisans didn't just survive these brutal winters behind German lines. They developed an ingenious system of underground bunkers called Zemlyankas that were completely invisible from just a few yards away. These earth-covered shelters used the ground itself as armour, camouflage, and insulation all at once. This is how Russian partisans built Zemlyanka bunkers to survive World War II winters. Please share in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced or learned any traditional survival skills yourself, we'd love to hear your wisdom. Subscribe for more ancient knowledge. The winter problem behind enemy lines was brutal and immediate. Partisan fighters found themselves scattered across vast stretches of forest and marshland, sometimes days or weeks from any friendly town or village. German patrols methodically combed the countryside, their boots crunching through snow as they searched for any sign of resistance activity. The cold was merciless. Temperatures regularly dropped toward -40 degrees Celsius, and wet snow fell in thick curtains that soaked through clothing before freezing solid. Biting winds cut through the forest canopy, finding every gap in worn-out uniforms and threadbare coats. Supply lines were virtually non-existent, and the clothing these fighters wore was often salvaged, patched, and poorly suited for prolonged exposure to such extreme conditions. In this desperate landscape, Soviet partisans discovered an ancient solution that would prove to be their salvation. The Zemlyanka, a word that literally translates from Russian as earth hut or dugout house, became the cornerstone of partisan survival strategy. The term comes from the Russian word zemlya, meaning earth, combined with the diminutive suffix that creates Zemlyanka. This simple linguistic construction belied the sophisticated engineering and cultural wisdom embedded in these remarkable structures. At its most basic level, a Zemlyanka was exactly what its name suggested: a room dug directly into the ground, carefully roofed with logs, then buried under layers of soil and snow until it became virtually invisible from even a few yards away. The genius of the Zemlyanka lay in its perfect adaptation to the specific challenges partisans faced. Earth served as armour against more than just the weather. The thick soil walls and roof could stop bullets and shell fragments, turning the shelter into a protective bunker during firefights or artillery bombardments. But earth also functioned as the ultimate camouflage system. From the air, German reconnaissance aircraft would see nothing more than a slight rise in the forest floor, perhaps a natural mound or the remnants of a fallen tree. Even ground patrols could walk within yards of an occupied Zemlyanka without detecting any sign of human presence, provided the partisans maintained proper discipline and concealment protocols. The thermal properties of Earth provided perhaps the most crucial advantage. While air temperatures plummeted to deadly extremes, soil maintained a much more stable temperature that hovered close to the freezing point. This fundamental principle of thermal mass meant that the Earth surrounding a Zemlyanka acted like a massive heat battery, absorbing and holding warmth while blocking the penetration of exterior cold. When partisan fighters lit their small fires inside these shelters, the heat had a tremendous head start. Instead of trying to warm air that was 40 degrees below freezing, their fires only needed to raise the temperature from just below freezing to comfortable levels. This physics advantage made it possible to maintain livable conditions with minimal fuel consumption, a critical factor when every piece of firewood had to be gathered by hand and carried through enemy territory. The Zemlyanka was not a wartime invention born from desperation. These structures represented the continuation of housing traditions that stretched back centuries across Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. Peasant families had long built dugout homes and animal shelters using identical principles, passing down construction techniques through generations of rural life. When partisan fighters found themselves facing impossible winter conditions, they instinctively reached for this deep well of pre-industrial housing wisdom. Rather than attempting to invent entirely new survival methods under extreme pressure, they adapted and refined techniques that had already proven effective across countless harsh winters. This connection to traditional knowledge gave partisan Zemlyanka construction a sophistication and reliability that would have been impossible to achieve through improvisation alone. The partisans were not just digging holes in the ground. They were implementing a time-tested architectural solution that had kept families alive through centuries of Russian winters. Choosing the right site for a Zemlyanka required careful analysis of terrain and tactical considerations that could mean the difference between survival and discovery. Partisan engineers looked first for slightly raised ground that would naturally drain away meltwater and avoid the catastrophic flooding that came with spring thaws. Building in a hollow or depression seemed appealing for concealment, but experienced fighters knew that such locations could transform into icy ponds during temperature fluctuations, turning a shelter into a death trap. Dense forest cover provided essential concealment from aerial reconnaissance, but the ideal location featured mixed tree species rather than uniform stands. The varied shadows and irregular patterns created by different types of trees helped break up any subtle geometric lines that might reveal human construction to trained observers scanning the forest from aircraft or distant hills. Water access presented a delicate balance between necessity and security. Every Zemlyanka needed to be positioned near a reliable water source, but not so close that daily trips to collect water would create visible paths stamped into the snow. German patrols were trained to look for such signs of regular human activity, following worn trails that invariably led to partisan camps. The optimal distance placed the water source close enough for quick, silent trips, but far enough that multiple approach routes could be used to avoid creating telltale patterns in the landscape. The primary materials for Zemlyanka construction came entirely from the immediate environment, a necessity driven both by stealth requirements and the impossibility of transporting conventional building supplies through enemy territory. Soil composition determined structural integrity and thermal performance. Builders used loose topsoil primarily for the final camouflage layer that would blend seamlessly with surrounding forest floor, while the more compact subsoil provided stable walls that could support the weight of logs, earth, and accumulated snow without collapsing inward. Understanding these different soil types and their properties was crucial knowledge that separated successful Zemlyanka builders from those whose shelters failed under pressure. Forest timber formed the structural skeleton of every Zemlyanka. Straight spruce or pine trunks measuring 10 to 15 centimeters thick served as wall-lining posts and primary roof beams. These logs had to be harvested quietly, often during the darkest hours before dawn, to avoid detection by German listening posts. Saplings and smaller brush filled secondary structural roles, creating interior bunks and forming the lattice framework that supported the roof covering. Every piece of wood had to be cut by hand using axes and saws that produced far less noise than mechanized tools, though the work proceeded much more slowly and required significantly more physical labor. Organic materials gathered from the forest floor provided crucial insulation and weatherproofing elements. Moss packed between log-sealed gaps that would otherwise allow precious heat to escape and deadly cold air to penetrate the shelter. Fallen leaves mixed with available straw created insulation mats for floor platforms, keeping sleeping fighters elevated above the cold, damp earth. These same materials formed a fire-resistant barrier layer beneath the soil covering on the roof, preventing embers or sparks from igniting the wooden structural elements during stove operation. Snow itself became a vital construction material once initial building was complete. The final insulating blanket of snow on the completed roof provided additional thermal protection while helping to smooth and naturalize the shelter's profile so it appeared as nothing more than a gentle rise in the forest floor. Fresh snowfall continuously renewed this camouflage layer, ensuring that the Zemlyanka remained invisible even as seasons changed and surrounding conditions evolved. At the heart of every successful Zemlyanka stood the burzhuyka stove, a simple but ingenious heating system adapted from civilian models common throughout the Soviet Union. These potbelly stoves featured compact sheet metal or cast iron construction optimized for burning scrap wood, dried roots, and even improvised fuel like tar-soaked rope or small amounts of coal when available. Despite their small fireboxes, burzhuyka stoves produced remarkably high heat output, making them perfectly suited for warming tight underground spaces where every calorie of heat energy had to be maximized for survival. Construction of a partisan Zemlyanka began with marking out the precise footprint using measurements that had been standardized through Soviet engineering manuals and refined by battlefield experience. A typical detachment Zemlyanka featured an internal room measuring roughly 3.5 meters long, 3.7 meters wide, and 2.15 meters high. These dimensions provided enough space for a squad-sized group of fighters to sleep, eat, maintain equipment, and conduct planning sessions while remaining small enough to heat efficiently with limited fuel supplies. Larger partisan units constructed clusters of interconnected Zemlyankas, creating underground complexes that included separate sleeping dugouts, command bunkers, medical treatment areas, and storage facilities for weapons and supplies. The excavation sequence followed a careful protocol designed to minimize noise, visible disturbance, and the telltale signs of fresh construction that could betray the shelter's location to enemy patrols. Workers began by quietly stripping away snow and loose surface soil, spreading this material widely across the surrounding area rather than creating conspicuous piles that would stand out against the natural forest floor. The initial clearing revealed the actual ground surface and allowed builders to assess soil conditions and make final adjustments to the planned dimensions based on what they discovered below the surface layer. The main excavation proceeded in measured stages, with teams digging down approximately 1.5 to 2 meters while carefully preserving a shallow ramp that allowed workers to enter and exit the growing pit without requiring ropes or ladders. This access ramp served double duty during construction and would later become part of the entrance system once the shelter was completed. Simultaneously, workers cut a narrow entrance trench extending away from the main excavation. This trench would eventually be roofed over and camouflaged to appear as nothing more than a natural depression or animal path, providing concealed access to the completed Zemlyanka. Wall support and interior lining required precise carpentry work performed entirely with hand tools under conditions that demanded absolute silence during daylight hours. Builders set vertical corner posts first, using the strongest and straightest logs available to create the structural framework that would support the entire roof system. Horizontal logs or split log planks were then fitted between these corner posts, creating solid walls that could withstand the tremendous pressure exerted by surrounding earth and accumulated snow loads. Every gap between logs was carefully filled with moss and packed soil, creating an airtight barrier that prevented precious heat from escaping while blocking cold air infiltration that could make the shelter uninhabitable. Floor solutions varied based on available materials and the specific soil conditions encountered during excavation. The simplest approach involved creating a trampled earth floor that was raised 10 to 20 centimeters above the deepest point of the excavation, allowing any meltwater or condensation to flow naturally toward a small sump where it could be removed without flooding the living space. More elaborate Zemlyankas featured wooden pallets or log duckboards laid over a foundation of brush, keeping fighters' feet elevated above potentially damp ground and providing better insulation against the cold earth below. Sleeping platforms constructed from straw or evergreen boughs were elevated even further above the main floor level, creating distinct zones within the shelter and maximizing the warming effect of heated air that naturally rose toward the ceiling. Roof construction represented the most critical phase of Zemlyanka building, as structural failure could prove instantly fatal to anyone sheltering below. Main roof beams consisting of the largest available logs were placed across the shortest span of the excavation to maximize their load-bearing capacity. These primary beams were typically spaced approximately 30 centimeters apart to distribute the enormous weight of soil and snow that would accumulate above the shelter throughout the winter months. Smaller poles and gathered brush were laid perpendicular across these main beams, creating a continuous surface that would support the waterproof layer above, while preventing soil from falling through gaps into the living space below. The placement of the burzhuyka stove within the Zemlyanka required careful engineering to maximize heat distribution while minimizing fire hazards in the confined underground space. Experienced partisan builders typically positioned the stove near a wall opposite the sleeping bunks, creating optimal heat circulation patterns that would warm the entire shelter without creating dangerous hotspots or leaving cold zones where fighters might suffer from exposure. The stove sat on a carefully prepared foundation of flat stones or salvaged bricks that prevented direct contact between the red-hot metal and flammable wooden floor materials. This radiant heat system worked by heating the metal stove body until it glowed, creating infrared radiation that warmed bodies and surfaces directly rather than relying solely on heated air circulation. The surrounding earth walls absorbed this radiant energy and released it slowly, creating a thermal battery effect that maintained comfortable temperatures long after the fire had burned down to embers. Chimney routing and smoke control represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Zemlyanka engineering, as visible smoke could instantly betray the shelter's location to German reconnaissance aircraft or ground patrols. The standard tactical solution involved running the stovepipe horizontally for several meters through the roof structure or surrounding embankment before allowing it to rise vertically to the surface. This horizontal section served multiple critical functions that transformed a potentially fatal liability into a strategic advantage. The extended horizontal run carried smoke well away from the actual Zemlyanka location, so any observer detecting the smoke plume would search for the shelter in entirely the wrong area. Simultaneously, this horizontal section functioned as a primitive but highly effective heat exchanger, allowing the hot exhaust gases to cool significantly before reaching the surface. The physics of this cooling process provided crucial camouflage benefits during the extreme cold of Russian winters. Hot smoke rising into air temperatures of -30 or 40 degrees Celsius created highly visible vapor plumes that could be spotted from great distances, essentially broadcasting the location of hidden partisan camps to any enemy forces in the area. By cooling the smoke through the extended horizontal chimney run, partisan engineers reduced the temperature differential between exhaust gases and ambient air, dramatically reducing the visibility of the vapor plume and sometimes eliminating it entirely during certain atmospheric conditions. Ventilation and condensation management posed constant challenges in the sealed environment of an occupied Zemlyanka, where carbon monoxide poisoning and excessive humidity could prove as deadly as enemy bullets. The solution required balancing competing demands for fresh air circulation against heat retention and concealment requirements. Most Zemlyankas incorporated a small intake vent positioned near floor level, often constructed as a simple wooden tube or carefully controlled gap near the main entrance. This low-level fresh air intake worked with natural convection patterns to create controlled air circulation throughout the shelter. Warm, moisture-laden air generated by breathing, cooking, and drying clothes naturally rose toward the ceiling, where controlled leaks near the roof or through gaps around the chimney base allowed it to escape without creating visible steam plumes that could compromise concealment. The thermal performance of properly constructed earth shelters demonstrated the remarkable effectiveness of traditional building techniques adapted for extreme survival conditions. While outside air temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius, the soil surrounding a Zemlyanka typically maintained temperatures just below the freezing point, creating a 40-degree temperature differential that dramatically reduced heating requirements. With several adult bodies generating heat in the confined space and a small fire burning efficiently in the burzhuyka stove, internal temperatures could be raised to genuinely comfortable levels. Veterans of partisan campaigns reported that well-built Zemlyankas could become warm enough that fighters could remove their heavy coats and dry wet clothing, luxuries that would have been impossible in any above-ground shelter during the brutal Russian winter. This thermal efficiency meant that partisan units could survive extended periods behind enemy lines without requiring massive fuel supplies that would have been impossible to transport or gather without detection. The inhabitants of wartime Zemlyankas represented a diverse cross-section of people united by desperate circumstances and the need for survival behind enemy lines. Soviet partisan formations from Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia formed the primary users of these underground shelters, with fighters ranging from regular Red Army soldiers cut off during the German advance to local civilians who had taken up arms to resist occupation. Jewish partisan groups, including the famous Bielski detachment, constructed some of the most elaborate Zemlyanka complexes, creating hidden villages beneath the forest floor that sheltered not only fighters but entire families fleeing Nazi persecution. These underground communities sometimes housed dozens of people through entire winters, transforming simple survival shelters into functioning societies, complete with workshops, medical facilities, and even schools for children. The demographics of Zemlyanka inhabitants extended far beyond active combatants to include women, children, elderly relatives, and other civilians hiding from German roundups and deportations. Entire extended families would crowd into these earth-covered rooms, creating living conditions that tested every aspect of human endurance and cooperation. Pregnant women gave birth in Zemlyankas, babies took their first steps on packed earth floors, and elderly grandparents shared stories and skills that proved essential for group survival. This mixing of ages and backgrounds created unique social dynamics where traditional village hierarchies blended with military discipline to produce new forms of community organization adapted specifically for underground life. Daily existence inside an occupied Zemlyanka followed routines that balanced survival necessities with the psychological need for normalcy and human connection. Sleeping arrangements typically featured tiered bunks constructed along the walls, with straw mattresses and salvaged blankets providing minimal comfort in spaces where personal privacy became an impossible luxury. Everyone slept packed closely together, sharing body heat that supplemented the warmth from the central stove and creating human bonds forged through months of intimate proximity. The area immediately around the burzhuyka stove became the social center of Zemlyanka life, where fighters and civilians alike gathered to dry socks and boots, repair weapons and equipment, whisper over hand-drawn maps, and prepare simple meals from whatever food could be foraged, hunted, or obtained through dangerous supply runs to sympathetic villages. The organization of Zemlyanka communities required strict adherence to shared responsibilities and behavioral codes that ensured both physical survival and group cohesion under extreme stress. Rotating firewatch duties kept the vital stove burning safely throughout each night, with experienced individuals taking responsibility for managing fuel consumption, preventing dangerous carbon monoxide buildup, and maintaining optimal temperatures without creating visible smoke during daylight hours. Cleanliness protocols became matters of life and death in confined quarters where disease could spread rapidly through the entire group. Latrines were positioned well away from living areas and always downwind, while snow served as the primary medium for personal washing and maintaining basic hygiene standards that prevented the spread of illness. Essential tasks were distributed among all capable inhabitants according to their physical abilities and specialized knowledge. Wood-gathering parties ventured out during the safest hours to collect fuel for the stove, while water carriers made carefully planned trips to nearby streams or wells. Cooking duties rotated among those with experience preparing meals under difficult conditions, and everyone took turns standing sentry duty to watch for approaching German patrols or other threats. These responsibilities created a web of interdependence that strengthened group solidarity while ensuring that critical survival tasks received proper attention even when individuals became sick, injured, or temporarily incapacitated. The transmission of Zemlyanka construction knowledge relied heavily on oral instruction passed down from older peasants who remembered pre-revolutionary dugout houses and adapted by partisan veterans who had learned through trial and dangerous error. Village elders who had grown up in traditional earth-sheltered homes became invaluable advisors, teaching younger fighters how to read soil conditions, select optimal timber, and recognize the subtle signs that indicated structural problems before they became catastrophic failures. Experienced partisan engineers developed standardized techniques through multiple construction projects, refining their methods based on hard-won lessons about what worked and what could prove fatal in actual combat conditions. The evolution from traditional peasant dugouts to partisan bunkers reveals a continuous thread of architectural wisdom that adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of earth-sheltered construction. For centuries before the Second World War, rural families across Russia, Ukraine, and Poland had constructed semi-buried homes and storage cellars using identical techniques, creating structures that provided affordable housing and reliable food preservation in regions where above-ground construction materials were scarce or expensive. These civilian Zemlyankas often featured permanent stone or brick stoves with proper chimneys, small windows that allowed natural light to enter, and more durable wooden floors that could withstand decades of regular use. The construction process typically took weeks or months, with entire communities participating in the excavation and timber work required to create family homes that might shelter multiple generations. The wartime adaptation of these traditional techniques required fundamental modifications that prioritized concealment and rapid construction over long-term durability and comfort. Partisan Zemlyankas were deliberately smaller, darker, and more austere than their civilian counterparts, stripped of any features that might reveal their presence to enemy observers. Windows became impossible luxuries that would create light leaks visible from aircraft or distant patrols. Permanent chimneys were replaced with concealed stovepipe systems that could be quickly dismantled if the shelter had to be abandoned. Floor systems remained functional but basic, designed to be constructed quickly by fighters working with minimal tools and under constant threat of discovery. Jewish partisan communities developed particularly sophisticated variations of standard Zemlyanka design, driven by the unique challenges of sheltering large numbers of non-combatants in active war zones. The Bielski partisans and similar groups created elaborate multi-room complexes that functioned as underground villages, featuring hidden trapdoors that provided multiple escape routes, sophisticated air ventilation systems that prevented carbon monoxide poisoning in crowded spaces, and shared cooking facilities that could prepare meals for dozens of people simultaneously. These Jewish partisan Zemlyankas often included dedicated workshops where craftsmen repaired weapons, made clothing, and produced essential tools, transforming survival shelters into centers of resistance activity and community life. The technical innovations developed by Jewish partisans reflected both their urban backgrounds and the desperate circumstances they faced as targets of systematic extermination. Many had experience with urban construction techniques that they adapted for underground building, creating more complex structural systems than typical military Zemlyankas. Their shelters often featured multiple levels, with sleeping areas separated from common spaces and specialized rooms dedicated to medical treatment, food storage, and even religious observances that maintained cultural identity under the most extreme conditions. These Zemlyanka traditions connected to broader patterns of earth-sheltered architecture found across northern Europe and other cold climates. Scandinavian and Germanic pit houses from earlier historical periods used identical principles of excavation and earth-covered roofing, while Ukrainian burdey represented regional variations adapted to local soil conditions and available materials. Arctic peoples developed semi-subterranean dwellings that maximized thermal efficiency in environments where fuel was extremely limited, demonstrating the universal human tendency to seek shelter within the earth when surface conditions became too harsh for conventional construction. The recurring appearance of similar solutions across different cultures and time periods illustrates fundamental principles of cold climate survival architecture. When faced with severe weather, limited materials, and the need for concealment or protection, human societies consistently developed underground or earth-sheltered building techniques. The physics of thermal mass and insulation remained constant regardless of cultural context, leading to remarkably similar construction methods among groups that had no direct contact with each other. Modern applications of Zemlyanka principles can be found in contemporary earth-sheltered homes, survival cabins, and military field fortifications. Current building codes and construction techniques have refined the basic concepts with improved waterproofing, ventilation systems, and structural engineering, but the fundamental approach of using earth as insulation, protection, and camouflage remains unchanged. Military survival manuals and outdoor education programs still reference Zemlyanka-style construction as an emergency shelter technique, recognizing that the principles developed by wartime partisans retain their effectiveness for anyone facing extreme cold with limited resources. The enduring wisdom embedded in Zemlyanka construction reveals fundamental principles that challenge modern assumptions about shelter, heating, and human adaptation to harsh environments. The first and most profound lesson involves working with natural forces rather than attempting to overcome them through brute technological force. Earth served simultaneously as shield, insulation, and camouflage, transforming what appeared to be a liability into the foundation of an integrated survival system. This approach contrasts sharply with contemporary building practices that rely on thin-walled structures requiring massive energy inputs to maintain habitable conditions, essentially fighting against climate and geography rather than harnessing their inherent properties for human benefit. The physics of small, dense living spaces demonstrates how dramatically reducing interior volume can minimize heating requirements, a principle that becomes critical when every piece of fuel represents risk and exhausting physical labor. Mathematical calculations show that halving the air volume in a shelter can reduce fuel consumption by far more than 50%, as heat loss occurs primarily through surface area rather than total volume. Modern tiny house movements and efficient cabin designs unconsciously echo these same principles, though contemporary builders often miss the thermal advantages that come from earth-burned or partially underground construction techniques that Zemlyanka builders understood intuitively. Redundancy in survival systems provided multiple backup options that could mean the difference between life and death when primary systems failed or came under attack. Every well-designed Zemlyanka featured at least 2 separate exit routes, with the main entrance designed for daily use and a concealed emergency hatch positioned to provide escape options if German forces discovered and attacked the primary access point. Ventilation systems included multiple air pathways that could continue functioning even if one route became blocked or compromised. Chimney systems incorporated horizontal runs and multiple routing options that maintained smoke concealment while providing alternative configurations if repairs became necessary during winter months when abandoning the shelter meant certain death. The systematic incorporation of multiple exit strategies, backup ventilation pathways, and redundant heating configurations required additional labour during construction, but created survival margins that proved essential when partisan units came under direct attack. Each redundant system added complexity to the building process and demanded more materials and time, but veterans learned that shortcuts in backup systems often proved fatal when primary systems failed at critical moments during combat or extreme weather events. Cultural memory functioned as survival technology, transforming traditional peasant knowledge into sophisticated wartime engineering solutions that kept resistance fighters alive through the harshest conditions. Without the accumulated wisdom of generations of rural families who had built and lived in earth-sheltered homes, many partisan units would have lacked the practical knowledge needed to construct effective underground shelters. The detailed understanding of soil types, timber selection, ventilation requirements, and thermal management that enabled successful Zemlyanka construction could not have been developed through improvisation under combat conditions. This traditional knowledge base provided tested solutions to complex engineering problems, allowing partisans to focus their limited time and energy on tactical adaptations rather than fundamental structural experimentation. The transmission of this cultural knowledge from elderly peasants to young fighters created bridges between pre-industrial rural life and modern warfare, demonstrating how seemingly obsolete traditional skills could become cutting-edge survival technology when circumstances demanded maximum efficiency with minimal resources. Village elders who had grown up in dugout homes possessed irreplaceable expertise about reading soil conditions, understanding groundwater patterns, and recognizing the subtle signs that indicated structural problems before they became catastrophic failures. Contemporary society faces the troubling reality that much of this traditional knowledge has disappeared as rural populations moved to urban areas and industrial heating systems replaced local materials and traditional construction techniques. The detailed forest skills that enabled 1940s peasants and partisans to transform hillsides into livable homes have largely vanished, replaced by dependence on fossil fuel heating systems, GPS navigation, and prefabricated building components that require industrial supply chains to function effectively. This loss of practical knowledge creates vulnerability for future generations who may face energy shortages, supply chain disruptions, or climate emergencies without possessing the skills needed to create shelter and warmth using only local materials and traditional techniques.